Welcome to lecture number 20 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. It's a fairly sorry tale we have to tell. We'll begin by discussing really concretely what happened, who were some of the personalities, what were some of the major events, what were some of the major crises that brought this old and stable and much admired Roman Republic to a state of utter ruin. And at the end, we'll ask a few questions about why this happened. Was the system itself flawed? Were there people who were willing to manipulate the system in ways that people had not been willing to do before? Did some people discover flaws or perhaps opportunities, possibilities in this system to wrench it out of shape, to turn it to their own purposes? So we'll try at the end to explore some of those questions. Why did this happen? But first, we basically have to go through and say what happened. Who are the players and what did they do? When Attalus of Pergamum willed his kingdom to Rome in 133, there was a sharp public quarrel at Rome. You may remember my just mentioning that 2 lectures back when we were talking about the rise of the Roman Empire. At the end of that lecture, I sort of used Attalus's bequeathal of his kingdom to Rome as a kind of a symbolic end for that lecture, for the emergence of the Roman Empire, for an awareness of what the future held for the Mediterranean world. Well, when Attalus willed his kingdom to Rome, it wasn't immediately accepted because there were some very complicated political situations in Rome. A conservative party wanted no part of this legacy, for fear that it would lead to more entanglements in the East. Some of the old conservatives, the more traditionals in Roman politics, had begun to think, this empire is not necessarily such a good idea. It's really costing us a lot in terms of domestic order. But a progressive party, led by the brothers Tiberius, who died in 133, and Gaius, who died in 121 BC, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, the Gracchi brothers, wanted to accept the legacy. They had a whole host of social programs, land reforms, and others that they wanted to carry through. And they felt that the Attalid legacy would provide them with the wealth, with the money, with the resources necessary to accomplish their tasks. Now, not surprisingly, conservatives in Rome feared that this was a scheme to win political supporters. You see, some of them felt this was a scheme to win political supporters. Remember, we've talked about patron-client bonds in Roman politics. So some people, these people all played by the same rule book. They understood this system very well. So some people looked at the Gracchi and said, look, those guys are trying to use the Attalid legacy to buy support in Roman politics. There was another interesting little problem. Over a long period of time, going back more than a century before the Gracchi, as individual men, as individual small and medium-sized farmers had spent careers really in the Roman military, just by dint of circumstance, as a result of these long wars, various members of the senatorial aristocracy had bought up large tracts of land. They had also, in some instances, sort of acquired a great deal of public land around Rome that belonged to the state. But these people had kind of been settling on it and farming it and so on. One of the things the Gracchi wanted to do was redistribute land, get former soldiers back on the land. Well, some of the more conservative citizens at Rome were a little distressed by this because they've been holding a lot of that land for a long time. They didn't want to give it up. Well, what happened in the midst of this sorry spectacle was that tribunes were bribed, and when he himself tried to stand for the tribunate for a second consecutive year, Tiberius Gracchus was murdered. This was the first instance of political bloodshed in Rome. Over all these centuries, amidst any number of controversies, amidst any number of difficult, potentially contentious situations, never before had a Roman shed the blood of another in political contention. Now that line had been crossed. Well, when Gaius Gracchus carried on with his brother's plans, he and 250 of his allies were murdered by senatorial agents. The scale of violence was now becoming pretty dramatic in Rome. Now, after the deaths of the Gracchi, perhaps something like 75,000 people got land. And, excuse me, during the regime of the Gracchi, when the Gracchi were trying to put their land reforms through, perhaps something like 75,000 people received land allocations from the Roman state. That gives us some idea of the scale of social problems. Quite a large number of sort of indigent people, or if not indigent, then marginal people, to whom the Gracchi were trying to give land. The Gracchi idealistically said, we're just trying to give these people the wherewithal to be good, functioning members of society again. The Gracchi's opponents said, you're buying support. Probably a little truth in both positions. But in any case, after the death of the Gracchi, after the death of the two brothers, a lot of the senatorials began trying to take this land back. Now, this put the Roman people in a very, very difficult position. Society was increasingly becoming factionalized into two groups. Now, writers at the time used the words optimates, optimates, the best people, that's what they called themselves, of course, and populares, the popular element. Now, from the standpoint of the optimates, of course, the populares were the rabble. From the standpoint of the populares, of course, the optimates were oppressive and dictatorial and so on. Society was really becoming fractured in some very, very ugly ways. Now, amidst these political crises, Roman armies, under traditional senatorial leadership, were faring badly in several places. They'd had very serious problems in Spain for a number of years. But at the moment, the crises were actually in North Africa. Remember, they had conquered the area of Carthage as a result of the Punic Wars, and had not initially started expanding their conquests in North Africa. This began to wait until the last decades of the 2nd century BC, and Roman armies were doing very badly over here. Now, armies had been a way for people to rise very high in the estimation of their fellow citizens, but the army could also be a place for a person to sink in the estimation of his fellow citizens if he conducted himself poorly. In 107 BC, a man by the name of Marius, he was born in 157 BC, died in 86 BC, a new man, a novus homo. Now, what a new man was in Roman politics is a man without a history of family participation in political office at Rome. So the Romans had a category for the new man, somebody whose family had not held high office previously. Again, I've emphasized before, the relatively small number of families who had held office in Rome over a very long period of time. Well, in 107, Marius was elected consul, and he decided to take over the Numidian campaign, and he quickly had great success, great military success. Now, as it happens, Marius was a fine soldier. It also appears, contrary perhaps to all expectations, that he was an honest man. He really did seem to have a great problem with the fact that Rome had not been having success in the campaigns in North Africa, that there had been a lot of dishonesty, and he really wanted to clean up the situation. He also, in some important respects, began the professionalization of the Roman army. Now, before this time, in principle, every Roman citizen, that means every adult male Roman citizen, could be called to serve in the army under any circumstances that might demand his service. With Marius, we begin to shift to a situation where men go and enlist in the army, where you choose the army as a career, or at any rate, as something that you will do for a period of years. Now, this professionalizing of the Roman army, and then the very close connection between soldiers and their leaders, introduced a new shift in Roman politics. You'll remember we talked before about the fact that going all the way back to the Pyrrhic Wars, to the Punic Wars, veterans, military veterans, had begun to be a pressure group in Roman politics. Now the Roman army itself becomes a pressure group in Roman politics. This again was something new. We can see a linkage with the veterans having become a pressure group, but nevertheless there is something new here. Now, the senatorials were furious with Marius. They were furious with him for a whole lot of reasons. They were furious because he was successful where members of their group had not been successful. They were furious because in taking his first steps in the direction of professionalizing the Roman military, they regarded him as simply having built himself a great patronage machine. Is that what Marius had in mind? Probably not, or at least it would be unfair to say that that's the first thing he had in mind. He cannot have been unaware of this issue. In Roman politics, you were never unaware of finding support. Then Marius held the consulship several years in a row. Now, this was not strictly illegal, but it was highly unusual. In the past, you're consul, and you had to wait a period of years till you were consul again. Now, after about 100 BC, Marius withdrew a little bit from the public scene, but he remained a very influential popularis leader. He remained a very important sort of behind-the-scenes leader of the popular party at Rome. Now, in 90 BC, Rome's allies in Italy, the Socii, rebelled. Rome went to war against the Socii, and we remember this as the Social War. Marius won the Social War. And one of the ways that he was able to pacify the situation relatively quickly afterwards was that that the allies, the Latin allies throughout Italy, basically were given full Roman citizenship. Now, once again, Marius's conduct was an affront to the traditional Roman order. They hadn't been able to deal with the crisis. He did. He deals with the crisis in a very traditional Roman way. Be generous to your foe. Remember we talked about that? But here the generosity extends basically to giving the Socii, the allies, full citizenship. So if you're on the opposite side in Roman politics, how do you view that? Marius is just building another patronage machine for himself, you see? Well, did anybody trust anybody any longer? Did anybody believe anybody any longer? This is the way Roman politics begins to go. You could view Marius's activities from several different points of view, quite legitimately. Either we today looking back, or you can imagine his contemporaries looking at his conduct and saying, well, it's good and it's honest and it's serving the interests of the Roman people. Or no, it's serving his own interest. It's all self-serving. Which way was it? Probably a little bit of both. Marius's successes then alarmed the optimates even more. And then in Asia Minor, in Anatolia, a ruler, a local sort of big shot by the name of Mithridates, attacked Roman territory, and he killed several Roman merchants and some Roman tax collectors. Well, the Romans weren't going to stand for that. And they assigned a military campaign against Mithridates to the optimate Sulla. Now, Sulla was born in 138 BC, died in 78. So he was given the task of going to the east and punishing Mithridates for having the temerity to attack the Roman people. Marius was jealous. Marius was jealous that this great military command had not been given to him. Now, after all, in view of recent experiences, whether his campaigns in Italy or whether his victory in the Social War and so on, Marius would have been the obvious choice to be given a great military command. But the optimates had control of the Senate. They had the capacity to influence decisively the Roman voting assemblies, and they weren't by any means going to give Marius this opportunity. They give it to Sulla. Well, Marius was jealous, and he waged a considerable political battle back home against Sulla and his forces. There were all sorts of subtle things he could do to harm, to damage, to thwart Sulla's interests. So when Sulla returned from the east, he found, first of all, that Marius had died in the interim. No skullduggery, he just got old and died. But Sulla marched on Rome and massacred Marius's followers. Now here, again, the scale of political violence is going up, up, up. And you notice something interesting here. It has been the optimates who murdered the Gracchi, who slaughtered the Gracchi's successors. It was the optimates who slaughtered Marius's successors. Those very people who out of one side of their mouth said, we must stand for the old values, the traditional values, the old ways, the way our ancestors did it. Out the other side of their mouth, they said, let's kill these guys we don't like. Roman politics was becoming pretty ugly business. Sulla also issued proscription lists. He published lists publicly in Rome. Anybody whose name was on that list could be killed with impunity and his property taken over. His property taken over. Well, what was there to stop anybody from going and kill anybody who was a personal foe or even whose property you craved? This was a pretty nasty business as well. Well, the careers of Marius and Sulla taught the Romans, at least the elite among them, one lesson incontrovertibly. You want power in Rome now? You got to have an army. The old traditional political base, the base in Roman families, the base in your family having held office for a long period of time, this was no longer going to be enough. You're going to make your way in this new Roman political world, this world that had emerged between about 130 and 80 BC, over a period of, say, 2 generations. You want to rise in that world, get your hands on an army. Now, the first to act on this lesson was a man by the name of Pompey. Pompey was born in 106 BC, died in 48. He won, in the first place, a command to clear the pirates from the Mediterranean. Now, clearing pirates from the Mediterranean was a rather interesting command to get because it was one that could be extended in principle almost endlessly. A pirate is everything from a bandit to a merchant you don't like, to rebels in somebody else's political struggles, to your actual enemy. In other words, there was really no way of defining exactly who were these people that Pompey was going to go and clear from the Mediterranean. He got himself, in principle, almost an open-ended command. Well, subsequently, Pompey also got armies and was able to fight even in some other campaigns. Now, close on Pompey's heels, Pompey had taken the lesson, you got to get a military command. In his case, he got a navy. Close on his heels, was Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC. He died in 44. Caesar's family situation, his political background, is actually kind of interesting. He comes from one of the oldest families in Rome, one of the oldest, most distinguished families in Rome, but a family which had been for a couple of centuries sort of on the eclipse. They had not been providing officers regularly, had not been providing consuls and so on. So Caesar sort of brings this family back into prominence. Now, Caesar was elected consul in the year 63, and then he began maneuvering for a major military campaign. You may remember we said in an earlier lecture that one of the stresses and strains that the creation of the Roman Empire produced for the Roman Republic was a multiplication of offices. So very often the consuls, and sometimes even the praetors, after their period of service in office, would become a proconsul or a propraetor, and would then get a military command and go off to one or another of the areas of the Roman world where they might be expected to fight. So Caesar, his ambitions don't stop with getting himself elected consul in 63. That normally, historically, in the past, would have been the pinnacle of a public career at Rome. Now it's a springboard to get an army. Well, there is also, at the same time, at Rome, a man by the name of Crassus. Now, Crassus was crass. He came from a kind of a lower or middling family. He had going for him only this. He was the richest man in Rome. He was the richest man in Rome. He had enormous money, but he had no respectability. Remember we talked about auctoritas, that eminence, that dignity of great citizens. Crassus had none of that. Crassus had none of that either, at all. But this rather unsavory character, he made a lot of his money, for example. Rome was a city very largely built in wood. It's only from the time of Augustus Caesar, we'll be talking about him in later lectures. We'll mention him at the end of this lecture and talk about him in more detail in later lectures. It's from Augustus's time on that much of Rome was rebuilt in stone and brick. Much of the city was in wood, and as a result, buildings were frequently catching fire. Crassus had a habit of hanging around at night and going up to buildings that were on fire, and as people came running out, he'd buy the buildings. And then he'd rebuild things and sell them at enormous profits and so on. Well, he wants office and a military command simply to get legitimacy, to get a certain measure of sort of credibility. Well, as a result, these three guys, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, sort of pooled their political resources, pooled their material resources in 60 and formed what was called the First Triumvirate. Crassus, as I said a moment ago, he just wanted legitimacy. He wanted a military command that would somehow give him a kind of an authenticity in Roman politics that he otherwise lacked. Pompey wanted laws passed providing pensions for his veterans, those soldiers who had worked with him during his campaigns against the pirates. Caesar, as I mentioned a moment ago, just to repeat, wants a military command. Actually, where he wants to go is Gaul, and we'll come back to that in just a second. So, these three guys pool their political resources in 60 BC. Now, a political deal like this, was it illegal? No. Was it unusual? Yes. Was it unprecedented? Yes. And Cicero and others protested in vain against this outrageous manipulation of the Roman system. They said, this is not the way the system's supposed to be. What's curious here is these guys actually stayed on the right side of the law. They didn't actually do anything illegal, but they certainly were manipulating the system, and they were certainly manipulating it to serve their own purposes. Now, Caesar got his command. He went off and spent 8 years in Gaul. writing his commentaries and sending them back. Virtually every student who's ever done Latin in high school or in college has read some portion of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, very often the first Latin text that a Latin student encounters. But while Caesar was off in Gaul, Roman politics changed pretty dramatically. Crassus, first of all, who was a much better swindler than soldier, was killed on the battlefield and vanished from the scene. So his particular influence is now gone. The Optimates in Rome now turned to Pompey. They'd had some doubts about Pompey for a while, but now they turned to Pompey largely because they figure they can't possibly trust Caesar. So they turned to Pompey, and they use Pompey, and they use the Roman institutions to pass a series of laws that were basically designed to ruin Julius Caesar. I mean, they were really going after him with a vengeance. In 49 BC, Caesar's campaign, his command, in Gaul came to an end. He had to return to Italy. Now he comes back into northern Italy. Remember we talked several lectures back when we talked about the political geography of Italy, about the fact that peninsular Italy was Roman Italy and northern Italy was Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul on this side of the Alps. So when Caesar came into northern Gaul, when Caesar came into, northern Italy, he was still outside Roman territory. But then he marched down to a little river called the Rubicon. And as Caesar camped at the Rubicon River, he was faced with a very interesting dilemma. The dilemma was this. If he laid down his military command and crossed the Rubicon as a private citizen, his enemies would have destroyed him. And he knew it. And he knew it. If he crossed the Rubicon with his army, he's declared war on Rome. What's his choice? What's his choice? Well, Caesar's biographer tells us, Caesar, of course, one of these well-educated young Romans who was well-educated in Greek ways, his biographer tells us that he said, in Greek, alia, he said, hokibos balatai. In Latin, alia iacta est, the die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon, giving us a phrase in our political vocabulary. There was no turning back now. Well, this inaugurated a number of years of rather brutal and nasty civil war, not surprisingly. What were Caesar's goals? Well, people have been trying to imagine, to understand, to think about what Caesar's goals might have been for a very long time. First of all, of course, he had to survive. Now, this plunged Rome into a civil war. Caesar always said, this was forced on me. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. My enemies forced this on me. Caesar defeated, first of all, the forces of Pompey, and then established himself as dictator at Rome. Now, actually, dictator was a formal office under the Roman constitutional scheme of things. Going all the way back, in times of extreme necessity, the Roman institutions more or less suspended themselves and appointed a dictator for 6 months. Then he was supposed to return his powers. Caesar now appointed himself dictator, but with a kind of an open-ended term. So again, it's a bit of a manipulation of the system, and it's something ever so slightly consistent with the system. Many key figures of late Republican politics lost their lives in the next 3 or 4 years. Cicero died in this period. Pompey died in this period. Cato the Younger died in this period. That's worth remembering, because as slowly but surely a new regime began creating itself, most of the great figures of the last days of the Republic, however tortured those years were, most of the great figures were gone, and gone before their time. So one had, in a way, to reconstitute a political elite. That's not an easy thing to do in any society. Now, Caesar's dictatorship was reasonably enlightened. There were many reforms passed. I'll just mention, for example, the Julian calendar. One of the first great calendar reforms. In the 1580s, Pope Gregory XIII revised the calendar yet again, the Gregorian calendar, which is the one we use today. But for a very long time, and in some places in the world still today, the Julian calendar is still used. Caesar passed land laws and legal reforms and institutional reforms and a wide variety of measures. Scholars who have looked very closely at what Caesar did have been very much divided in their opinion. Was he functioning as this sort of dictatorial guy who was serving his own interests and the interests of his party? Or was he really a kind of an enlightened ruler who had a great vision for the Roman people and was just trying to do the right thing? Well, if we imagine those as ends of a spectrum, the truth is probably somewhere between those two ends of the spectrum. But the point is that Caesar's activity in this period was then, and has been now, controversial. What is clear is this: everyone was looking for a solution to the increasingly inevitable collapse of the Roman system. The Roman system that had been there for so very long seemed to be teetering on the brink of extinction. What to do? Well, in 44 BC, on the Ides of March, a group of disgruntled senators murdered Caesar. This was a fairly stupid act politically, actually. Whether these people simply seized an opportunity to get rid of their opponent because they were jealous of him because he'd gotten sort of more success than they had, or whether, as some have suggested, that they somehow honestly believed that Caesar was the problem. You get rid of Caesar, the problem goes away, is very hard to say. It's just very hard to say what they were thinking. Maybe they weren't thinking very much. But anyway, Caesar was struck down in the Roman Senate House and fell, ironically, at the foot of the statue of Pompey. Now the Roman world was plunged yet again into a period of civil war, this time lasting 13 years. There was now formed a second triumvirate. It consisted of Marcus Antonius, that's Shakespeare's Mark Antony, who was the heir to Julius Caesar's forces. There was Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew and adopted heir. And there was a man by the name of Lepidus, who just happened to have a big army under his command at this moment, and so accidentally became a kind of a key figure briefly in Roman politics. Well, the triumvirs, in the first place, divided up the military responsibilities they faced, defeated the forces of those who had killed Julius Caesar, and then had to begin thinking, well, what's next? First thing, not surprisingly, Lepidus was shunted aside. End of Lepidus. He wasn't killed, but he was moved aside. For several years, Octavian and Antony sort of stared each other down. Octavian generally in the west, Antony generally in the east. Antony is having his dalliance with Cleopatra, which gives us movies and novels and all kinds of stories. It was pretty clear that one of these guys was going to win and one of them was going to lose. What was Octavian's position, for example? What did he think? What was he trying to do? With Antony, he simply looks like an ambitious guy who as much as anything, was profiting from the circumstances in which he found himself. Maybe he was, in some idealistic sense, kind of an heir to Caesar's position. That's very hard to say. As I was indicating a moment ago, it's very hard to say exactly what Caesar's position was. Octavian, well, I think it's easier to see in prospect what Octavian's position was. And we'll turn to that in future lectures. We'll see what Octavian actually did as Caesar Augustus, and perhaps that'll give us a little bit clearer picture of what he was thinking about during these 13 years of intense civil war. But the Roman Republic is gone. One way or another, it's gone. Why? What happened to the Roman Republic? What happened to this remarkably stable, effective, much admired regime? First of all, the opportunities and challenges presented by the empire simply devastated the old political system. The number of officers expanded, the number of opportunities expanded. Military situations produced a wholly new set of circumstances at Rome. It's unreasonable to suppose that the old Roman city-state of Rome could have survived with an empire. Power and influence and unimaginable wealth could be won in the empire and deployed in Rome with no checks by the traditional system. The old system was checked. Remember those Roman families. Remember that pater familias. Remember, teach your son law and the history of your family and how to farm your property. And again, we saw maybe that's an ideal, maybe not. But that's the way the Romans thought about things. But going off and conquering vast lands and taking vast plunder from those lands and coming back and buying support in Roman politics was not how the game was supposed to be played. And yet at the end, that's how it was played. Disruptions in the countryside led to countless numbers of landless, rootless people who moved into the city of Rome and who felt no commitment to any old-fashioned values, to any great Roman way of doing things, to any Roman system. These were people who were massively disrupted as a result of the political and also the military crises of Italy over more than a century. And finally, I think Greek culture, for all its glories, eroded the simple, sturdy values of the Romans, turned them more cosmopolitan. Aristotle once said that in an ideal state, all citizens could be summoned by the cry of a herald. That may not be practical, but the Roman experience, at the very least, makes one think.